The 1980s were certainly a challenging time in the automotive industry overall, but perhaps nobody really felt that challenge more than Pontiac, the once performance division of General Motors. For instance, take a look at this cover from 1981 Pontiac brochure, and you'll notice the tagline here at the bottom, "More Pontiac know-how to the gallon." This is certainly not something that you would have seen in a mid-1960s Pontiac brochure, as an example. But by this point, there were CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards, that were mandating that auto companies achieve or exceed a fleet average of 27.5 miles per gallon by the mid to late 1980s. Those standards would later be relaxed under the Reagan administration, but when they were in place, automakers were feverishly working to downsize their vehicles and shrink the engine's underhood in order to achieve those fuel economy targets. Hence what you saw on the cover of this 1981 Pontiac brochure. Now, beyond the corporate average fuel economy standards, something else was happening over at General Motors during this time. If you think back to the years from 1976 and before, General Motors divisions generally produced their own unique V8 engines. There were some exceptions, like in the early 1960s, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac shared a new aluminum block 215 cubic inch V8. It was standard in the Olds and the Buick for 1961, but it was optional in the Pontiac Tempest in 1961. Pontiac, of course, had the standard half the 389 V8, the four-cylinder engine underhood in the Tempest for 1961. But in any case, generally, General Motors divisions were using their own unique V8 engines under hood. And so when you bought a Pontiac, you got a Pontiac V8, an Olds V8, a Cadillac V8, etc. However, after the 1976 model year, General Motors really started commonizing and reducing the number of engine variants that they had. I guess it just didn't make sense anymore to have all of these different engines being produced. And as an example, in the full-size cars, if you wanted the largest available engine in your Buick or Oldsmobile, that was an Oldsmobile 403 cubic inch V8. Didn't matter if it was the Buick Electra, as an example. It now had a range-topping Olds V8 under hood. You could also get the Olds 403 in a number of Pontiacs, including the full-size cars, to supplement the Pontiac 400 or the Firebird, where the Olds 403 was under hood for California sold cars as well as some other models. And there were other examples, too, of this. The one division that really maintained their exclusive engines was Cadillac, who still had the 425 cubic inch engine when 1977 rolled around. But by 1981, the subject of this video, that proliferation was even further reduced. And why do I call 1981 the last year for true Pontiacs? Well, there's a couple reasons, and just a couple facts as well that I'll mention. 1981 is the last year that the Bonneville nameplate would be atop the true full-size General Motors car. For 1982, the Le Mans nameplate would be swapped out with the Bonneville on the G-body vehicles. And Pontiac originally had thought, as part of the corporate average fuel economy standards, they didn't need the big full-size car that they had previously in 1981. So they had originally planned to just drop the full-size car altogether. But of course, by the time this decision was going into effect, they realized that gas prices were starting to come down and consumers still wanted large cars. And so they had to bring the Parisienne into the lineup, which was a car that was always around in Canada, effectively kind of a warmed-up Caprice, if you will, and put that back into the lineup as the full-size car. And the Parisienne would remain for a number of years until Pontiac would finally get out of the rear-wheel drive game in 1987 when their new Bonneville would come out on the General Motors front-wheel drive H-body platform. I guess I should have one caveat to that. Pontiac did continue on with the full-size B-body wagon through the 1989 model year, but after the Parisienne left the lineup after the 1986 model year, in 1987, 88, and 89, that wagon would be called the Pontiac Safari, kind of a return to the old-school Pontiac wagon nameplate. In any case, back to 1981. And so I mentioned This would be the last year of a true Bonneville that was full-size. It was also the last year for a two-door B-body full-size Bonneville. But most importantly, 1981 was the last year for Pontiac's own V8 engine. In this case, the 265 cubic inch Pontiac V8 was the only one that you could get under hood in a Bonneville. So the last year for the Pontiac V8 in the full-size cars, like I said, it kind of went out with a whimper because the largest Pontiac V8 you could get was the 265 cubic inch V8. Now, Pontiac had made V8s of all different shapes and sizes over time since the original Pontiac V8 introduction in 1955. And these V8s span from the smallest, being 265 cubic inches, all the way up to 455 cubic inches, which was the largest production Pontiac V8. There are many different variants along the way. Many people are familiar with the Pontiac 389, the 421, the 400, the 428, the 301, which would be the first of the smaller deck variants versus the 326 cubic inches versus the Pontiac 455 that were all physically the same external size. The 265 and 301 had shorter deck heights than the other ones. But even Pontiac had produced, as I mentioned, half a V8 engine. The engine that was standard in the Tempest in 1961, the half of a V8, the four-cylinder engine, it was half of a 389 cubic inch V8. So let's call it round up 195 cubic inch four-cylinder. But 1981 was the last year that Pontiac V8s would be produced. And it's kind of unfortunate because, as you can see from this brochure here, the largest gasoline V8 engine that you could get in your full-size Pontiac for 1981 was actually a 5-liter Olds 307 cubic inch V8. One down from that was the 4.3-liter Pontiac V8 that I mentioned, the 265 cubic inch V8. And then the standard engine was a 3.8-liter Buick engine. So in 1981, the engine lineup for these full-size Pontiacs had a Buick as the standard engine. The Pontiac was one up from the Buick. And then the Olds engine was actually the top engine that you could get under hood in 1981. After that, in 1982, the Pontiac V8 was gone. And you could still get a 301 in 1981, but you could only get it in a Firebird. And after that, it would be gone. In 1982, when the Firebird was redone, it would use exclusively Chevrolet V8 engines, 305 cubic inch V8s under hood in carbureted as well as crossfire fuel-injected form. It would have a Chevrolet 2.8-liter V6 as an optional engine. Interestingly, the only true Pontiac engine that you could get in a 1982 Firebird was, can you guess it? The Iron Duke 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine. Ooh, making all of around 90 horsepower. That was the only Pontiac engine that you could get in your 1982 Firebird. So let's take a closer look at this 1981 Bonneville Brougham. Interestingly, this one has the highest optional engine in it that I mentioned, the Olds 307. So it's not even a true Pontiac, but 81, as I mentioned, was the last of the true Pontiacs. Now, this particular 1981 Bonneville Brougham is a sub-9,000-mile copy, and it's absolutely fantastic. I'm not normally a fan of this particular generation of General Motors cars, but something about this Bonneville Brougham, I think it's probably a combination of the color, the fact that it's a two-door, is just speaking to me. So, yeah, we'll see. Now, notice in the 1981 Bonneville, you do have a revised front end versus the original variant from 1977 to 79, namely in that you have the turn signal integrated in the middle there, in between the regular headlight as well as the bright light. You also have, I would call it, a timid execution of Pontiac's split grille up front. Yes, there is a little bit of a divider that has the Pontiac emblem in the middle, but Pontiac's starting to get away a little bit from that split grille theme here, I think. Although in the bumper does have a pretty distinct split. Not necessarily the same clearly as the execution on the 59 Bonneville that had a very wide divider in between the two grills. But it's still there a little bit. And you do have an interesting texture here. You have the vertical bars, which are really the major theme. And then underneath that, you have the egg crate theme as kind of a minor theme. So you have a major and minor theme, a texture within a texture, gives the front end some little extra pizzazz, if you will. Now, one other thing that you have is a little bit of that Pontiac signature arrowhead front end with the point where the two shoulders on either side of the hood come together to form this point, and a little bit of a protrusion in terms of the grille. It had been blunted by this point because of the bumper impact standards, and I think Pontiac designers were also trying to get away from it a little bit, perhaps trying to find a new design theme, but it's still present up front. The other thing that you notice is this car does have the optional cornering lamps. Let's take a look at those in more detail here. Now, these cornering lamps look pretty small, but they were functional. Cornering lights, of course, were introduced in 1962 on Cadillacs to the industry, and by this point, they had become a relatively popular option. Also, you can see in this particular photo the optional Rally 2 wheel body color, Rally 2 wheels, I should say, looks fantastic on this car. Pontiac had this wheel as an exclusive for a number of years, and I think it does really jazz up this full-size car. Perhaps the fact that the car has them and the body color Rally 2 wheels, it's something that, let's just say, helps the overall looks. And, of course, you have this wide rocker molding, super wide rocker molding that you got on the upper-end Pontiacs that help differentiate it from the Chevrolet and other vehicles. And unfortunately, you got a super wide body side molding that you can see there too. At least it looks okay. It's got a little bit of an arrowhead tip to it. And now if we look on the full-on side view, you notice that super wide rocker molding. Of course, here on the Pontiac, you have fender skirts. Those would kind of go in and out in terms of popularity. A number of the GM divisions, when these downsized cars were introduced for 1977, did away with the fender skirts, including Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, but Pontiac kept them. And I think they add a little tasteful touch to this particular car. Also notice the rear overhang and how large it is. This is still a pretty big car despite its 116-inch wheelbase that was downsized versus the previous generation. But you did still have a lot of full-size room and comfort, helped by the fact that the car had a lot more upright windows and doors, less tumble homes. So you got more room inside. Now, you also see this car has the half vinyl roof, the half toupe, the vinyl roof that I would say designers really had. This was a half-hearted attempt at a vinyl top. Probably was a compromise between the design team and the marketing team that the designers never like vinyl roofs. I don't know of a designer that really cares for them, but the customers love them. And so I think what happened here is the designer said, well, we'll give them a vinyl roof, but we'll only put it on the back quarter of the car so it doesn't ruin the overall look. And I think on this car, it works. Other cars, I have to say, I'm not a fan of this kind of quarter toupe look. And out back, you have this kind of grid-style tail lamp, the egg crate-style tail lights that riffs off of the minor theme and the grille up front. And it is kind of a wall-to-wall look back here, which was a curious choice because other General Motors divisions like Buick were really kind of exploiting that wall-to-wall tail lamp theme. And here Pontiac seemingly appropriated it, but tried to put its own spin on it by putting the ice cube tray style to the tail lights. Because if you had just a thin horizontal bar, as an example, bisecting two portions of the tail lamp, well, that would just read Buick. And I don't know that this was necessarily all that successful because it didn't connote Pontiac. Pontiac was doing some interesting things during this time frame. Not only did you have a copy of the wall-to-wall tail lamp design up front, as I mentioned, they were kind of getting away from that split grille. And then you had this, I don't know what it was, like a gold starburst emblem where you can see the trunk lock cover. It has this little jazzy gold doodad look to it. So I'm not quite sure what designers were trying to do during this time frame to Pontiac design, probably trying to modernize it a little bit. But it doesn't quite read Pontiac to me as much as the other cars did. Now, one place where I think designers hit a home run was on the interior of this Pontiac. I love the biscuit kind of pleated seats here with the buttons in the middle and the, let's call it, upside down U-style dash theme with the warning lights up top. I think it's a great instrument panel theme as well as a great interior theme. Although you don't have any of the super cool IP wrapping into the doors here. The IP is certainly distinct from the doors. And the IP is a bit of a copy of the 1970 Continental IP from Lincoln that had a very similar theme. But I think it looks good. And you have the luxury cushion or luxury sports steering wheel here to tell you that your Bonneville was not only luxurious but also sporty, along with quite a bit of fake wood grain. And if we take a closer look at the dash, you can see in the far right pod, this one actually has the rally gauge package. It's got all the little, engine coolant temperature, a volt gauge, no tachometer in this car, but at least you got a full complement of gauges to make sure that the engine was running okay under hood. Of course, this one has manual air conditioning, and you have the so-called crotch cooler vents there below the steering wheel as well as below the glove box on the passenger side. Even the door panel on this car really is a thing of beauty. I love that the designers incorporated that biscuit theme with the buttons into the door panel. It's got lots of soft touch materials up top and on the top section of the armrest, the casket handle door pull. I do think that this is just a beautiful door panel. And of course, the little lights in there too to show that you bought a Bonneville Brougham, and those would help light the way when you open the door at night. Make sure that there wasn't a puddle there. Some people call them puddle lights. Now that really leaves us with what's under hood. And as I mentioned previously, this car has the Olds 307 cubic inch V8 under hood. It was making 145 horsepower at this particular point in time. It's kind of the sad days of the American auto industry. The standard engine in the Bonnevilles was the 3.8-liter Buick V6, which made 110 horsepower. Optional was the previously mentioned 4.3-liter Pontiac V8, 265 cubic inches, that made 120 horsepower, and this was the top engine you could get, 145 horsepower Olds 307. So it certainly wasn't all that powerful. Didn't have a heck of a lot of torque either. I think 245 pound-feet. Wasn't bad, but it just wasn't the big block torque of your, let's just say. And, people may do with it. The Olds 307 is a pretty pleasant engine, especially these earlier variants. They have a bit more pep and zip than the latter variants, but they're very smooth and reliable. And, this one also had the Rochester electronic feedback quadrajet carburetor, which was not as good as the regular quadrajet, but still not bad when it came to electronic feedback carburetors with things like mixture control solenoids, etc. You also see the R4 style pancake air conditioning compressor. That wasn't all that great. They cooled pretty well, but they always tend to leak air conditioning out. They're just not that well made. But regardless, a pretty decent engine under hood in this Pontiac, just not a true Pontiac. Although 1981, as I mentioned before, would be the last year for the true Pontiacs, which if this had the 265 cubic inch V8 under hood, I think that would be absolute perfection, because it really would be the last true Pontiac with a Pontiac V8, a two-door, the last of the two-door B-body cars for Pontiac. Be pretty sweet, but this car is gorgeous as it is. So what do you think? Do you like this 81 Bonneville Brougham? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.